Good morning. Two presentations this morning. The first focused on criminal neglect, and the second on what's called non-accidental injury. A little bit of notice at the beginning. There's some unpleasant pictures. The purpose is to show you the different kinds of cases we see, and they're just used. Obviously, they are all of the photographs, radiographs you see are from cases, and the purpose obviously is to illustrate the different kinds of cases that you can see if you're doing forensic work. So I want to get us all on board. Sometimes basic terms are misunderstood. So just to start, anybody have a answer for the first question? What is veterinary forensic medicine? I'm going to give you the answer then. So it's one of possibly different answers. This is mine. Forensic veterinary medicine is veterinary medicine practiced in a legal context. These are called medico-legal cases. And that's really significant, and I'm going to refer back to that many times during the presentations, that how you function as a veterinarian in these cases has to do with the fact that there is a potential criminal prosecution for animal cruelty. Also, animal cruelty is a legal determination. It's applying the law to a particular set of circumstances. Evidence is collected by both veterinarians, law enforcement, witnesses provide information about a possible crime, but it's the responsibility of law enforcement and the prosecutor's office to apply the law to that particular set of circumstances. It is not a veterinary responsibility. Veterinarians do not make the determination that there is animal cruelty. Obviously, if you do this kind of work, you have a sense of whether a crime may have been committed, whether you're looking at animal cruelty, and certainly veterinarians make reports of possible animal cruelty, but in the end, the determination is a legal one. I have another question for you, because you did so well on the first. What is the definition of the word forensic? Anybody want to answer that? The word forensic comes from the Latin adjective forensis, meaning of or before the forum. In modern use, the forum is a court of law. Any information presented by an expert witness in a court of law is considered forensic information. Forensic science is the use of scientific information to answer questions raised in a court of law. So it's not CSI, it's not trace evidence. That's not the equivalent. The equivalent is whatever an expert witness presents in court. For a veterinarian, it may be something as simple as a microchip. You scanned the animal, you found that it had a microchip, you were able to trace it back. In New York City, for instance, it wouldn't be uncommon for us to trace it back to the city shelter, the animal care centers of New York City. It may give us information about, at least at the time the animal was adopted, who the animal was adopted to. It may give us medical information that was gathered at the time that the animal was in the shelter. So it can be very, very important, but it can be also very simple. And it may be crucial to a case. It may be central to a case. It may give law enforcement the identity of the perpetrator. So something as simple as a microchip can become very important forensic information in a case. A veterinarian that testifies in court is considered an expert witness. An expert witness is an individual with expertise in a particular discipline based on training and experience. So your training is veterinary school, and then any other kind of education you've done subsequently. And experience is what you've seen. Even if you haven't seen animal cruelty cases, you're functioning as a veterinarian, you're diagnosing, you're prescribing, you're certainly qualified as an expert in veterinary medicine and science. The trier of fact, which can be a jury or a judge, the defendant gets the opportunity to determine who they want to determine whether or not they're guilty or not guilty. That trier of fact gives weight to a witness's testimony based on whether they believe the witness is truthful. Has anybody testified? Has anybody ever been on a jury? Yeah? It's a great experience. If you ever have the opportunity, you should do it. It's very interesting to see how the cases are presented and also to see how witnesses testify. If you don't believe the witness is being truthful, you'll discount whatever evidence they're bringing to court. And that evidence may be central to the case. So, as a veterinarian, the most important thing you carry into court with you is your integrity. The belief that you are not biased, that you are objective. You're not working for law enforcement. You work parallel and alongside law enforcement, but you're working separately and independently. And it's important that you present yourself that way. You're simply stating the medical facts of the case in as unbiased and objective way as you can. The other thing about testifying as an expert is obviously you speak in a certain language as a veterinarian. That language is not understandable to non-medically trained people. So you need to communicate with the people in the court the way you would with a client, for instance. Whenever you're working with a client, you're always translating in your head from medical language to language that can be understood by someone who then has to provide care for their animal after they leave the office. And that would be the same basic way that you testify. So all of that work that you do, working with non-medically trained people, whether it's clients or in a shelter situation or some other situation, is very valuable and is excellent training for testifying in court. So just a couple of interesting texts. These are human texts. Bones is a book written by Dr. Douglas Ubelaker. He is a forensic anthropologist who worked with the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. I put a lot of references in my presentation, and then you'll get there'll be a PDF available to you for this. So the reason I put them in the presentation is so that you then will have them available to you. So you don't have to, unless it's really of tremendous interest to you, take them down while we're doing the presentation. But I wanted to read something from that book, Bones. First, there can never be a negative moral consequence to the truth. And in order to protect the truth, every science demands complete objectivity of its practitioners. There have been times when I have been subjected to intense persuasion, both beforehand and on the witness stand, by advocates who are anxious to tailor my testimony to fit their suit. There's also a risk from the witness's own ego. No one is exempt from the human desire to be smart, to know the answer. Lawyers from both sides often play on the human temptation for an expert to say more than the facts or his or her expertise reasonably allow. That's very, very important. You're going to be asked questions you may not know the answer to. That's what you testify to. I don't know the answer to that. Or it may be, I don't recall that. It's okay. Again, what they're looking for is for you to be truthful. You're going to always present significant medical evidence in the case. You just may not know every fact and or an answer to every question that's asked, which is just fine. Dr. Lockwood presented some of these texts yesterday, so again, they'll be you'll get the PDF with them. This is the book on the left is the text, the forensic veterinary text by the Dr. Helen Monroe and Dr. Ronald Monroe. They're two pathologists who focus on forensic veterinary medicine in Scotland. It's an excellent text. It's my favorite. Small, concise, very practical. It gives great information. It's really accessible and easy to get answers to that. The one on the right is interesting. It was produced in Minnesota by animalfolks.org. a not-for-profit, and it was produced, Ann Olson is in charge there, and was produced to give Minnesota veterinarians a sense of forensic veterinary medicine. So again, they focus on both the legal and the medical part and how veterinary medicine fits into these legal cases. That's available online. It's free as a PDF. I would think if you email them, they may be able to send you the actual text, but it's great. It's really well done. And Dr. Lockwood mentioned this. This was September of last year. This is the first issue of the Journal of Veterinary Pathology that was devoted completely to forensic veterinary medicine. So 23 articles just on forensic veterinary medicine, really a tremendous reference that has not existed before. The IVFSA has been mentioned. At the North American Veterinary Conference, they always have a forensic tract. And then there's the graduate program in forensics that's online through the University of Florida and the ASPCA. You can do the 5 core courses, which give you what's called a graduate certificate in veterinary forensic medicine. You can also do a master's degree applying those 5 courses to a total of 30 credits, and the master's degree can be thesis or non-thesis. So lots of opportunities now, lots of resources, honestly, that didn't exist 10 years ago. So a big change in what's available to veterinarians and other people interested in animal cruelty and the medical aspects of that. Recognizing and reporting is a phrase that started with, in human cases, recognizing and reporting child abuse, for instance. Every case has to begin with a complaint to law enforcement. If law enforcement is not informed of a case, there is no case. These are legal cases. They have to be initiated by law enforcement. Even where I am at the ASPCA in New York City, and we work with NYPD on all of our cases, if somebody in our animal hospital sees a case they think may be possible animal cruelty, certainly I will consult with them, but nothing is going to happen unless they call NYPD. So every case has to be initiated by law enforcement, and you can go through all kinds of steps, and if that doesn't happen, there's just no case. So if you go on VIN and you do a search for animal abuse, it would not be unusual for somebody to post a question and ask the general question is, do you think this is animal abuse? And then there's lots of back and forth. And I'm always a bit confused by it because I think the quick answer, and it's not an easy answer, but the quick answer is if you're wondering if it should be reported, then you should report it. It's pretty straightforward. What you're doing is making a good faith report. You're not, again, determining that there is animal abuse, but you are concerned enough about how the animal presented to you that you think that there should be additional investigation. And the only way the human part of the case is going to be sorted out is by law enforcement. You're not going to do it as a veterinarian. You're not qualified to do it. It's not in your purview. Your responsibility is medicine. So if you think that there may be something happening with an animal in a particular home setting, you have to contact law enforcement. There may be other things happening, and you'll see that during these presentations. You know, animal cruelty doesn't exist in a vacuum. There will be frequently other things happening. There could possibly be people at risk, children. There may be domestic violence. And so by you reporting what you think looks to you like animal cruelty sets a whole series of steps in motion that may benefit that animal, maybe other animals, possibly people. So it's very significant to make that call. And I'm not saying it's an easy thing to do, but if you have that sense, you should make the report. There are 2 types of state laws about animal cruelty that are of interest to veterinarians. One are the laws that pertain specifically to animal cruelty, and the other are laws that address veterinary reporting of animal cruelty. which is not uniform across the country. It varies. In New York State, veterinarians are provided with what's called immunity from civil and criminal prosecution if they make a good faith report for companion animals. Okay, does that mean that if you do equine work you shouldn't be reporting it? No, but the only law that they were able to get through the legislature specifically dealt with companion animals. This is, we have a humane law department in 2014, before 2014, and from 1866, if you were here for Dr. Lockwood's keynote, that was the period of time when the ASPCA in New York had a humane law enforcement department and humane law agents. And then we handed off responsibility for responding, investigating to animal cruelty complaints to NYPD in 2014. And this card was created. We still have a humane law department. We have multiple former NYPD executive level folks there. That means captain and above, captain of precincts. There are 77 precincts in New York City. And they assist NYPD with cases. They act as liaisons. And one of the things they did is provide this card that can go in a police officer's memo book. These are all of the possible laws in New York State that have to do with animal cruelty. So it's not just the misdemeanor and aggravated animal cruelty or felony level cruelty. Abandonment is part of it. Dogfighting is a separate law. It's very possible that somebody will be charged with multiple charges for a single case. For instance, if there's a dogfighting case, and I'm going to show you an example, and in addition to the fact that it's just dogfighting, an animal is injured and hasn't been provided with proper medical care and is suffering as a result, that person can be charged separately with animal cruelty. So a lot of laws apply to it, to animal cruelty, and it's law enforcement's responsibility to be aware of that. It's the prosecutor's responsibility to decide what charges are brought. Animal cruelty is a multidisciplinary effort. It's not just one person. The veterinarian has their role. There has to start, as I said, with a complaint to law enforcement. The complainant, it could be a veterinarian. It may be that you see something brought to you in a shelter or in an exam room in an animal hospital, but it could be somebody in the public. There's law enforcement. Veterinarians, if they get involved in a case, are going to have two roles. One is the forensic part, collecting information about the animal's health when it presents, documenting that, and then in addition, providing medical care. So that's what we do in New York City. We do both the forensic part, where we examine the animal, do our complete evaluation, document it. We do lots of photography. I'll show you that we have a standard approach to every case that doesn't vary from case to case. And then we hand it off to a completely separate set of veterinarians and staff that provide the animals with medical care. And obviously we're in close contact because you may not collect all the information you need during that initial evaluation at intake. Then, of course, there is a prosecutor or district attorney, judge, jury. We work closely with the animal placement department. Obviously, something that's important is that we get the animals out of the situation where they're at risk and get them into a new safe location. There are legal issues involved with that. There's ownership of animals. Whoever, quote unquote, owned the animal has to relinquish that. NYPD is aware of that. On the back of that card I showed you is actually the language for relinquishment. They would write that in their memo book. The person would sign it. And that's a big, big part of the case, is getting that animal out of that situation. And then in addition, because we are going to examine the animal, collect information, we have to have legal permission to do that. Just like when an animal comes to an animal hospital, people have to sign something saying you have permission to do these diagnostic tests. There's the monetary part as well, but we need permission to do our evaluation. If we can't get permission from the owner is not always the suspect, sometimes not, then NYPD may need to get a search warrant so that we actually do have legal permission to go ahead and do the examination. If the animal is in any kind of crisis, we can always provide emergent care. Emergent care requires that you do a complete medical evaluation, so part of what I want out of the case is the forensic veterinarian is that evaluation, but in order for the medical care to move forward, you need to do that. And I always feel like primary for me is the animal's health and welfare. I can always come back if I'm questioned in court why I did something, that's my, as a veterinarian, that's what's most important to me, is that I want to provide good medical care, the best medical care for the animal, and that's why I had to do this series of diagnostic tests. In some situations, we work with people in different social service agencies because there are always people connected to this, so different aspects for each case. Very important, each discipline has their expert role. There must be mutual respect between the disciplines. You're not law enforcement, you're not a cop. You have to respect the decisions they made. They are experts in what they do, and you want them to respect what you do. They want, you're going to make your, do your evaluation, make your diagnosis, and you want them to respect that. And you saw that there can be put pressure on the veterinarian to come to a certain conclusion, but you have to be independent. Going back to Douglas Ubelaker's statement that I read to you. Boundaries must be understood and respected. This is very similar to a child abuse case. When I started doing this, which is a while ago, there was the veterinary knowledge base, and a lot of information that I use over the years is just standard veterinary medicine and science. But in terms of approaching a cruelty case, there wasn't much there. So I went to the federal government's website, childwelfare.gov, and there's lots of information that is applicable to the work we do. How the disciplines work together, what your approach should be on the case. So if you haven't ever looked at that, it's actually very worthwhile. They have a whole set of what they call user manuals, and they sort of define what the different roles of all the different disciplines are. And obviously communication is key. The more communication, the better. Veterinary medical forensic examination is separate and independent of law enforcement investigation. It's an impartial search for the truth. It's the veterinarian's responsibility to make an accurate and truthful determination of the animal's health. The forensic veterinary medical investigation may or may not support a finding of abuse. So you find what you find. And then I want to point you to the Innocence Project. If you're not familiar with it, it's another website you can go to at the bottom there, just www.innocentproject.org. What they do is they will go back and look at evidence, this is human crime, that was used to convict someone that's now incarcerated, but the only test that they do is DNA. DNA is the only thing that they do. It's not automatic. Some states don't allow it. There have to be a whole series of laws that allow a state, someone to go back and look at the evidence again, but DNA didn't exist when a lot of people were incarcerated, or many years ago, or it may not have been used in a case. So as of July 7th, 2017, there were 350 people in this country that were exonerated based on going back and doing DNA testing of evidence that had been previously collected. And 149 alternative perpetrators were identified. So half of the cases, the actual perpetrator was identified. But these people were incarcerated for 15, 20, 25 years. Again, you're interested in a truthful and complete evaluation of the animal's health. So what's your role as a veterinarian? You do that initial evaluation. You also will do treatment for the animal, obviously, and you document your findings. Very important because this becomes medical evidence in a case. So there's your medical record, laboratory tests, radiographs, photographs. In New York City, we have to act very quickly on cases. We establish something called a case snapshot. It's very brief, but we provide that to NYPD within 24 hours of having the opportunity to see an animal. It just got an identifying photograph. If there are significant wounds, we can add some photographs. We don't want to make it too long. And then very basically, these are the initial findings. It's not, doesn't draw necessarily, sometimes it can, but for the most part, it doesn't draw conclusions about the case. But they love that. They love the fact that they actually have an identifying photo. It helps if they're going out and canvassing a neighborhood, trying to find out who an animal is attached to. If we give them that, they like that feedback. You know, they've done their part. They bring the animal to us. Very quickly, they get a response from us. Again, it doesn't necessarily draw conclusions that we'll draw later on after we have all of the medical information that we're going to gather, but it's a really important part of how we communicate with NYPD. At some point, if the case is going to go forward as a criminal prosecution, we're going to write a much more detailed statement of our findings. And that's going to be passed along to law enforcement in the district attorney's office. And then we may or may not testify in court. The majority of cases in the United States are resolved by plea negotiations, more than 90%. We're seeing hundreds of cases a year in New York. In actual trials, I probably testify in 2 or 3 at most during the year. There may be other hearings that I testify in. There may be grand jury testimony. But as far as actual trials, just a few trials each year. I think the veterinary statement and court testimony are the hardest thing for veterinarians to do as far as these cases go. You're better off with that statement. You know, stick with the medicine. Don't try to draw a conclusion that you can't draw. I mean, if you can come to a concrete statement about something, that's great. But maybe what you come to, which is very significant, is a definitive diagnosis of what the animal's medical problems are, and that's very adequate. Remember, you don't know the rest of the case. You don't know what witnesses have been identified. You don't really know necessarily the specifics of the law enforcement investigation. You have your role to play as an expert in veterinary medicine. So one more time, am I being redundant? Providing expert medical information about the animal's health, and if necessary, participating in a criminal prosecution is the veterinary role. Okay, so what is criminal animal neglect? As I said, it's a legal determination, and this is the law. You know, it's not a veterinary determination. Now, you can have your idea about what you think, you know, looks like a crime has been committed, but in the end, somebody's got to look at the law, and it's not going to be you, and decide that, yes, this is criminal animal neglect. I highlighted the part that really specifically applies to neglect, where it says in the middle, or deprives any animal of necessary sustenance, food, or drink, or neglect, or refuses to furnish it such sustenance or drink. So when I first looked at that, I'm like, well, I always thought sustenance was food. So why are they being redundant? And what I found out is there are 2 things. One is that this is the law, and that's part of how it's applied to a specific set of circumstances. But then there's 150 years of case law. This law has been applied in New York State since 1866, with some changes in 1867. So we have 150 years where juries and judges have interpreted this law and applied it to case after case after case. That's called case law. You're not going to be familiar with that. But the attorney should, the prosecutor should. They should know how this law has been interpreted in New York State courts. Or if you're in another state, in the courts of another state. Most animal cruelty cases are prosecuted under state law. So what I found out is sustenance refers to everything else other than food or drink that's necessary for the animal to have normal health or sustain its health. So even though in New York state law it doesn't say specifically you have to provide veterinary care for an animal, that's how that word is used by district attorneys to prosecute a case where an animal was hit by a car, sustained a broken leg, and nothing was done to help the animal. That's the part of the law that is used by the prosecutor. So that's case law. And sometimes the terms that's used, and it will vary depending on where you are, is it's called a failure to treat. So most cases of neglect in New York State are prosecuted as misdemeanors. And just simplifying a misdemeanor statute, it's an overt act or a failure to act, which is basically the neglect part of the law. Causes unjustifiable physical injury, suffering, or even death. And it's any animal. There was a case in New York State where a tropical fish was killed. It was killed as part of a domestic violence kind of situation. It was the father terrorizing the family by stepping on the pet fish, and that was prosecuted. So any animal in New York State, not every state defines fish or reptiles or amphibians as animals as far as for legal purposes. And you don't have to intend to cause the animal harm. You just have to have been responsible for the animal's welfare. So you don't, that's important for the prosecutor. They don't have to prove intent. Aggravated animal cruelty is the felony level cruelty in New York State, and that, in my experience, is usually with physical abuse, when an animal is physically injured. I've seen a couple of cases of severe neglect prosecuted as aggravated animal cruelty, but it's much more common that it's a physical abuse case. And it's for companion animals or domestic animals, animals kept as pets. So it doesn't have to be just dogs and cats, but they have to be, to some extent, defined as a companion animal in New York State. There are different ways to classify animal cruelty cases. It can be by the number of animals, small scale or large scale. That's Anaya on the left. She came in. She had a body temperature of 80 degrees. She was starved. She was left out. It's December in New York City. She left out basically in the yard to die. She survived and did well, found a good home. And on the right was a quote-unquote sanctuary in northwest Pennsylvania with 700 cats with calicivirus rampant and freezers full of deceased cats, and a very bad situation. So a large-scale case. Also puppy mills, dog-fighting cases, cockfighting cases all fit into that large-scale case, certain hoarding cases. There can also be case classification by medical problem. So the types of things that are seen with large-scale cases, you will always see with all of the cases, live and deceased animals. Maybe long-term inadequate nutrition. Thank you, Jody. Jody is a pathologist, we've gone back and forth about using the term starvation, which to some extent, you can't determine medically. We go back and forth about it. Anyway, I use long-term inadequate nutrition now. Respiratory disease, like that cat situation, neglect of health, bite wounds, maybe dog fighting situations where bite wounds are not provided with care, severe dental and ear disease, very common in hoarded cat situations, physical injury, parasitism. Then the small scale cases, again, live and deceased animals. As far as neglect, long-term inadequate nutrition, it can be an adult. It can be in a growing animal, hair coat matting. There can be complete matting. It's got to be extreme to be prosecuted, but those exist, prosecuted as criminal neglect. or what are called strangulating mats. Especially small dogs like Maltese come with hair mats wrapped around the legs, and in one particular leg, usually actual obstruction of blood flow, and it strangulates the paw, and the paw can die. Embedded collars, another type of neglect case. Exposures to extremes of temperature, like Anaya out in the cold in December, or heat stroke kind of cases, animals put in cars on a hot summer day, and then neglect of disease or physical injury, what I mentioned before as failure to treat. So we have a standard protocol for each animal for the small-scale cases. We can do more with a small-scale case than we can with, 80 animals. If you have a large-scale case, every animal has to be examined, and every animal should be photographed. They cannot bring a charge of animal cruelty to a group of animals. It's an individual animal charge. So if you have an animal and there's going to be a charge of animal cruelty, you have to have the medical information to support that. You can't say generally, a lot of them had ear infections, a lot had dental disease. That can't be used in court. So we always obviously do a physical exam, complete set of basic laboratory work, CBC, chemistry, urinalysis, fecal. We might do other diagnostic tests as needed. Radiography, all cases, minimum of chest and abdomen, all cases. Okay, this is all cases. We don't differentiate. An animal is presented to us. I don't say, well, I think this is what I should do for this case and do that. It's always the same, at least initial evaluation of the animal. And obviously photography on all cases. And then you have to come up with a definitive diagnosis. You can't go into court with a presumptive diagnosis. You can't say, I think this is what the animal had. You have to have a definitive diagnosis. If you don't get that far, it's difficult to prosecute the case. Anytime I see a lump externally on an animal, any kind of wound, we want to radiograph that area. Would not be unusual for there to be bone fracture under some kind of swelling or lump. Crime scene photos in individual cases have become very, very important to us in these cases. Frequently, they actually help give us the diagnosis. So NYPD, they all have smartphones. And so they're always taking pictures now. And literally, some of the cases, the medical part is answered based on that photograph that we see. So I'll show you a couple more. But this puts in context how the animal was treated. And it is very powerful, and it's evidence that will be used in court. And there's a difference between this animal in that situation and what the dog would look like, on the necropsy table, where it's a nice, clean, clinical setting. It's a much more powerful image and is used as evidence in court. In terms of underweight animals, I'm going to spend some time on this, but the word emaciation is used a lot. Okay, and obviously one of the most common kinds of neglect is not providing an animal with adequate food. So it's useful to be able to describe the animal's body condition with a defined term. And so that's what Purina did for us, other than its use in clinical medicine, with their body condition scoring system. And there are two articles that came out in 1997. Dottie LaFlamme is the author. She's at Purina. If you can get a hold of those, they're really good reading, because this is what the Purina system is based on. And it's the only scientifically validated system for body condition scoring. There is no other. They did a certain type of scanning called DEXA scanning to determine body composition in a large group of animals. And that's how they came up with this 1 to 9 scoring system. So, Dr. Lockwood discussed it last night. We're really not prosecuting people for animals being overweight, so it's the 1 to 5 part of the scale that becomes very important in animal cruelty cases. Each step in that scale is a 5% increase in fat in the body. And that's all this scale refers to is fat composition. Does not refer to muscle. And I know there's a muscle condition scoring system, but it is not scientifically validated. So we don't use that. And this is not weight either. It's 5% of the body's weight each step. So for instance, if you have a 25-pound animal and you increase its weight, its fat content 5%, you're increasing the body weight by 2.5 pounds of fat. If you go from, and those are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 are the Purina numbers. If then the animal weighs 27.5 pounds as a 2 or very thin or very underweight, and you add 5% body fat, you're now going to be adding 2.75 pounds of fat. So it's 5% increase for each step. And the amount that you're increasing increases, it's not 2.5 pounds each time, it's 5% of whatever that number is. So when the animal gets to a thin body condition of 3 and it weighs 30.25 pounds, the 5% increase is now 3 pounds. So that's how the Purina system works. And again, it's only referring to fat. But if this is the original Purina, they simplified this. This was the best for our work because it gives all 9 steps. If you go down from a 3 to a 2, the thing that's really significantly different is that it says there's now minimal loss of muscle mass. Is this exact? No. Meaning, is every animal follow this from, to get to a 3 from a 5, they've only lost fat? No. Some animals may have lost some muscle. This is an approximation, but it gives you something scientific and some structure to talk about the animal's weight, its body composition. And then to go from a 2 to a 1, what's really significant is obvious loss of muscle mass. It's very significant. So in terms of that 5% part, the animal that goes from a 1 to 2, they've lost a significant amount of muscle to be at a 1. To go to a 2, they're going to add muscle back on. So it's not just the 2.5 pounds that they're increasing. There has to be weight associated with the muscle mass increase. So again, just be familiar with how this scoring system is set up. This was, and if you're familiar with the current veterinary therapy textbooks, this was actually an article on obesity, but they also give the whole Purina scoring system. And what I liked about this is it gives the actual percentage body fat. So at emaciated, it's less than 5% of the body is now fat. And when you get up to ideal, it's 20 to 24%, 20 to 25%. It doesn't have to be exact. Females have a slightly higher fat composition than males. So, toward the higher end, it would be like females compared to the lower end would be males. But think about the dog species. It's the only species where from the smallest to the largest adult, there can be 100-fold difference in weight. You can have a 1-pound teacup type dog and a 100-pound dog, Great Dane, or more. There's no other species that has that variation, and all of the different body types. So this is not exact. This gives you some guidelines, but Pit Bull's most well-muscled dog, on the planet. So they have a lot of muscle to lose. If you get a Pit Bull that looks emaciated and has lost muscle mass, it won't look like a Pit Bull. So they have a lot of weight to lose because they have so much tissue that they can actually use for nutritional needs if they're not being fed. So you're looking for the skeleton to become prominent when the animal's going from a 5 down to a 1. If you're seeing the spinous processes of the vertebral column, you're seeing the actual outline of the scapula, the scapular spine, you're seeing the femur, all of the ribs, pelvic bones, you have to have lost significant muscle mass. The infraspinatus and supraspinatus are the scapular muscles. There's no way to see that scapular spine unless you've lost that muscle mass. The temporal muscles are another area. They have nice round heads. You know, they lose the muscle and all of a sudden that area on top of their head becomes concave. So that's what you look for to make your determination that you have an emaciated animal. They talk about in the Purina system a narrow waist. That's looking at the animal from the top. It's a radiograph showing that the width of its weight is literally the width of its backbone. The skin is tight against the transverse processes of the lumbar vertebrae. That animal could not be more narrow. And this is a different animal, but again, that's the kind of thing that they talk about when you say has a prominent waist or a narrow waist. So temporal muscles are lost. That's the dog on the left, should have a nice round head, does not. And then that's a cross-section of at L3, lumbar vertebrae 3. And look how the apaxial muscles are up again and mask the spinous process of the vertebrae. So if you can see them, that muscle has to be gone. That's how you get to a score that an animal is emaciated. You know, because you know that the only way you're seeing that underlying skeletal structure is because it's lost so much muscle. Emaciation does not mean that the animal has been starved. There can be an underlying medical problem. The dog on the left had chronic severe hookworm parasitism. Not that that can't be prosecuted, but it was not clearly just inadequate nutrition. The dog on the top right, intestinal lymphosarcoma, that was not prosecuted. The puppy had parvovirus, and the dog on the bottom right, exocrine pancreatic insufficiency. So you have to come to a definitive diagnosis. There are different things that you're looking for in an adult as far as clinical findings to support long-term inadequate nutrition, either a 2 or a 1 on the Purina scale. And then when you get the animal, they eat and gain weight without significant medical intervention. Okay, if they have an underlying disease, feeding them, they're not going to put back on weight. You have to treat the disease process. If you don't, the reason they lost weight to begin with is whatever the disease process was, it caused them to be inappetent, to lose their appetite. They're not going to gain it back unless you resolve the medical problem. There's a concern about overfeeding them in the first 7 to 10 days. They're existing on a metabolism where they're using their own tissues for nutrition. They've switched over to this starvation metabolism. They don't know how to process food. You have to give them time. So you have to be careful. We basically we calculate their resting energy requirement. The first day we only give them 1/3, the second day 2/3, and finally the third day 3/3, maybe intravenous fluids. They're frequently dehydrated if they're emaciated and have been neglected. And then we continue with an RER for maybe 7 to 10 days. Okay, we get through that point and the majority of them will have started transitioning back to a normal metabolism. But if you measure electrolytes, liver enzymes, we always do that CBC chem the first day and we repeat it at 6 days. It's very valuable because or iStats, you may see, I haven't seen it much, electrolyte abnormalities that are seen with people that develop refeeding problems. But we've seen cases where an animal comes in, we get that first laboratory panel, and it doesn't really seem to represent what we're seeing clinically in the animal. And it's because they've been in that condition for months, weeks, months, and have reached some kind of steady state, and it's just not representative of what's happening in their body. They may have like severe pyoderma, and you expect neutrophilia and maybe high globulins, and you see nothing. You do a test 6 days later, and all of a sudden they're responding to the medical problem. So very valuable to do the additional clinical pathology. And all body systems are compromised when you don't have adequate nutrition. The easiest to see are the skin, the hair coat, the loss. You can see the skeletal appearance of the animal, but the immune system, every tissue in the body needs nutrition. Every cell in the body. So if they're only using their own body tissue for nutrition, They're not getting adequate nutrition, and everything is compromised. There was a paper done with some of our animals a few years ago, and the primary clinical path abnormalities were hypoalbuminemia and anemia. Those were the two that we saw were statistically significant in terms of long-term inadequate nutrition. Reduced muscle mass, so they have a weak posture. Their protein nitrogen metabolism is not normal. They don't have muscle. They're not producing ammonia. You're not going to see BUN the way you would normally. You all of a sudden lose. You've realized how important looking at blood urea nitrogen is when you actually don't have it to look at, because they don't have the muscle mass to produce it. They eat objects or substances with no nutritional value. Gastric ulcers are a possibility. You may see melanoma more common in a deceased animal than a live animal. It's typically sort of at the end, somewhat of a terminal clinical finding. Pressure sores or decubital ulcers. Cats, because they're not getting adequate amino acids, their coat color changes, becomes more red, less dark, because they're not having normal melanin deposition. So here's a dog. Same dog, testifying in court. The best thing you can say about the dog on the left, you can give lots of medical information. That's not what a pit bull looks like. It's just not what a pit bull looks like. That's what a pit bull looks like. So just stating generally for the court that this is literally a physical transformation in this animal from June until August, where it gained 20 pounds. And a lot of that's going to be muscle. The posture is different. Dog is standing more erect. Just a completely different animal as a result of feeding with no significant medical intervention. There's not much in the way of laboratory research that was done to give you information about starvation. It was done a long time ago, but certainly you would not get that kind of research approved that I'm going to starve a bunch of animals so I can follow their laboratory tests. But this is from Colorado, maybe 40 years ago, and their answer to obesity, this was a treatment for obesity, was what they called total caloric restriction. They didn't feed them, okay? And that's the weight change over weeks. So 8% the first week, but then it sort of stabilizes to get to like a 25% loss in weight, which is sort of about what you need to get to an emaciated animal. It takes many weeks. So that question can be asked in court, and there's not a lot of information out there, but this is available. And then if you try to get an animal that's emaciated to get back to ideal, you're talking about at least a month or more. 2 weeks down the road, they're not going to be ideal. 3 weeks down the road, they're not going to be ideal. It takes a long time for all of that to happen in the body. So I'll let you read this because I think I'm out of time. But this is human stuff, but just also starvation and what happens and how metabolism changes so significantly when you're starved. Okay. I guess we'll end there, right? Because I need to. What time? Thank you.